The Cursed House. Family's Desperate Getaway. As autumn wanes, an air of despair cloaks a struggling family returning to their roots. Desperate and defeated, Sang and Tang, alongside their children, find themselves reluctantly seeking refuge with relatives in a small, dilapidated village. The house they move into harbors a sinister history, shadowed by secrets and foreboding energies. Tensions with their new hosts only exacerbate their plight as unexplained events creep into their lives. But Tan's mounting fear and Sang's skepticism collide with unexplainable noises, haunting apparitions, and memories of tragic deaths tied to the cursed grounds. As the family unravels amidst fear and isolation, one chilling encounter forces them to confront a malevolent presence that may be far more dangerous than they ever imagined. Part 1. Returning in Defeat. The narrow, winding dirt path to the village felt more like a cruel labyrinth than a road home. Every step Sang took felt as if it dragged him further into a pit of despair. He tried to steady himself, keep his head high for his wife, Tan, and their 2 children. The late autumn air was sharp, cutting through thin clothing and making their exhaustion all the more painful. Leaves, dry and brittle, swirled in mournful circles around their feet, as if mocking their return. To Sang, the trees, stripped bare of foliage, looked like gnarled spectres whispering accusations of failure. Tan walked a few paces behind her husband, holding the hands of their children, Bao and Mai. The children's faces were pale with exhaustion, their lips dry and cracked from the journey. Tan's heart clenched at the sight. She had no words of comfort to offer. All her reassurances had worn thin. Her own despair was a weight that pulled her shoulders down, but she masked it with every ounce of strength she had left. A mother must be strong, she told herself over and over again, but inside she was crumbling. The old gate creaked as Sang pushed it open. It groaned like an omen, a sound that made Tan's stomach churn. The familiar sight of Min's house, more weathered and worn than she remembered, should have been a comfort. Instead, it loomed over them, dark and uninviting. Min stood in the doorway, his expression as unreadable as the shadows that played across his face. His wife, Tuyet, was a step behind him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Their welcome was as cold as the late autumn breeze that swirled through the yard. Brother Sang greeted, trying to force warmth into his voice. It cracked under the strain. Min nodded, but there was no embrace. No reassurance that the family would be safe here. Toyet's gaze, sharp and disdainful, landed on Dan and lingered. Tan braced herself, knowing what was to come. Behind her smile, Toyet's eyes were like daggers, ready to find the weak spots and press in deep. "You've come a long way," Tuyet said, her words as brittle as the dead leaves that littered the yard. "I hope you're not expecting much." It took all of Dan's restraint not to flinch. "We're grateful for anything," she replied softly, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. Min stepped aside to let them in, but there was no warmth in the gesture. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and neglect. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. Every piece of furniture was old, worn, and poorly cared for. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and oppressive, as if waiting for the right moment to crawl closer. Bao clutched his mother's hand tightly, his eyes wide. He could sense it too, the suffocating weight of unwelcome memories and the creeping chill of something unseen. Tuyet led them to a cramped room at the back of the house. "This is all we can spare," she said curtly. The room was little more than a storage space, with old boxes and forgotten belongings piled high. There was barely enough room for them to sleep. Sang nodded, swallowing his pride. "It's more than enough," but Tuyet's eyes narrowed, and Dan could see the challenge in them, the silent accusation that they had come here to leech, to burden. Dan wanted to scream, to tell Tuyet that they had nowhere else to go, that they weren't here by choice, but her tongue was laden and her chest felt tight. Instead, she began to unpack their meager belongings, keeping her hands busy to stop them from trembling. Night fell quickly, as if the sun had decided it wanted no part of what was to come. The children huddled close to their parents, shivering under thin blankets. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers scraping against the glass. Tuyet's voice drifted through the thin walls, harsh and cutting. "I don't know how long we can put up with this," she was saying to Ming, her words muffled but clear enough to pierce through Dan's heart. Sang lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Each creak of the house, each gust of wind felt like a taunt. He had failed them. He had dragged his family back to a place that offered no safety, no peace. Tan lay beside him, silent tears soaking her pillow. She knew he was awake but didn't reach out. There was too much unsaid between them, too much pain. They lay there side by side, separated by the crushing weight of their shared despair. In the dim glow of the moonlight that crept through a crack in the wall, Bao stirred. "Mama," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm here," Tan replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "Will we be okay?" His question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. Tan hesitated. She wanted to say yes, to tell him that things would get better. But all she could do was hold him tighter. "We'll try, my love," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll try." Outside, a branch snapped, and somewhere deep in the shadows of the garden, something shifted. The wind carried a low, mournful wail that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She didn't mention it to Sang. She didn't want to add to his burdens. But as she closed her eyes and tried to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was watching, waiting. And in that moment, Tan realized that the fight for their family's survival had only just begun, and it would demand more than they were ready to give. Part 2. A Tense Refuge. The morning sun, pale and feeble, did little to chase away the gloom that clung to Min's house. From the moment Sang and his family had arrived, a shift had occurred, a subtle change in the atmosphere that seemed to draw tension like iron filings to a magnet. The walls themselves, once silent witnesses to the daily routines of Min and Tuyet, now seemed to vibrate with unease. Tan felt it in the way the floorboards creaked beneath her every step, as though the house was murmuring discontent with their presence. Breakfast was a strained affair. Tan worked quietly in the cramped kitchen, trying to make something edible from what little food they had brought with them. Tuyet's eyes followed her every movement, sharp and calculating. Tan could feel the weight of that gaze, like a physical presence pressing into her back. When she turned to offer a tentative smile, Tuyet's lips twisted into something far from friendly, a sneer that sent a chill down Tan's spine. "Using up our rice already," Tuyet's voice was low but carried a venom that stung. "It's just a little for the children," Tan replied softly, forcing calm into her tone. "I'll make it up, I promise." Tuyet's laugh was cold and mirthless. Promises don't fill an empty pot in the dim light. Tan's hands trembled as she stirred the tin porridge. She knew better than to argue. Their arrival had upended a fragile truce between Min and Tuyet, and now she was caught in the crossfire. Sang, unaware of the exchange, stepped into the room with Bao and Mai trailing him. His face was lined with exhaustion, but he tried to muster a smile for his children. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against chipped bowls, and the occasional hollow thud as Tuyet set down a dish with more force than necessary. Every bite felt like swallowing stones. Sang chewed slowly, eyes downcast, while Tan stole glances at Tuyet, watching for the next barb. Bao and Mai, sensing the tension, barely spoke. When Bao whispered something to Mai, and they both stifled nervous giggles, Tuyet's glare cut through them like a blade. "Quiet," she snapped, her voice echoing through the small house. "If you're going to stay here, you'll show some respect." The children fell silent, their faces pale. Tan wanted to reach out, to comfort them, but fear rooted her in place. Sang set his spoon down with a loud clatter, and for a moment it seemed as if he would speak up. But the weight of their situation pressed him back into his seat. Standing up to Tuyet would only deepen their misery. He bit his tongue until he tasted blood. As the day dragged on, the house felt more like a prison. Sang busied himself with small repairs, mending a loose hinge, patching a drafty window, anything to keep his hands moving and his mind occupied. Each time he crossed paths with Min, his older brother's silence spoke volumes. There was no camaraderie, no shared burden. Min avoided his gaze, his expression stony. Whatever bond they once had long since withered, leaving only brittle remnants. Tan tried to make herself useful, scrubbing floors and washing clothes, but nothing she did seemed to satisfy Tuyet. There was always a sneer, a muttered insult just loud enough for Tan to hear. "You think this is enough? Do you think you can erase your debts by cleaning a floor?" The words cut deep. Tan bit back tears, scrubbing harder until her fingers were raw. She told herself that it was just words, that she was strong enough to endure. But inside, something cracked a little more each day. The house's decrepit state mirrored their despair. Cracks snaked through the walls, and damp spots bloomed like dark, malignant bruises. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. At night, the wind whistled through unseen gaps, carrying whispers that seemed to mock their plight. Bao and Mai huddled together under a thin blanket, their eyes wide in the dark. Mama Mai whispered one night, "I don't like it here. It feels wrong." Tang held her daughter close, stroking her hair and murmuring soothing words she barely believed. She felt it too, the cold, creeping sensation that seeped into her bones. The house was more than just old and decrepit, it was alive with something she couldn't name. The shadows stretched too far, moved too quickly. When she turned her head, she thought she saw flickers of movement at the edge of her vision. But each time she focused, there was nothing. Tuyet seemed almost to revel in their discomfort. She moved through the house with an air of possession, her footsteps heavy with authority. When she spoke to Min, it was with clipped words that carried a mixture of anger and satisfaction. "They're taking up space," she hissed one evening, her voice just loud enough for Tam to hear through the thin walls. "They're taking and taking, and what do we get? More mouths to feed, more problems." Tam clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. She wanted to storm in, to demand compassion, to remind Tuyet that family should mean something. But fear held her back, fear of losing even this miserable shelter. Instead, she lay in the dark, listening to Tuyet's words echo in her mind, feeling more like a trespasser than a guest. Sang's frustration grew by the day. He tried to shield his family from Tuyet's barbs and Minnie's indifference, but each failure cut deeper. One afternoon, as he worked to repair a sagging section of the roof, Tuyet appeared beneath him, arms crossed and eyes narrow. "You're wasting your time," she said. "This house doesn't need fixing by someone who can't even fix his own life." The words were like a slap. Sang's hands trembled, but he didn't respond. He kept hammering, each strike louder than the last, as if trying to drown out her voice. Night brought no relief. Tan lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere a loose shutter banged against the wall in a relentless rhythm. Bao whimpered in his sleep, his small hands clutching at his blanket. Tan stroked his forehead, whispering lullabies that felt hollow. As days turned to weeks, the tension in the house became unbearable. Toyet's hostility was a storm that threatened to break at any moment. Tan walked on eggshells, avoiding conflict as best she could, but every interaction felt like a battle. Sang grew quieter, retreating into himself, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. One evening, as Tan prepared a meager meal, Tuyet stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Don't get too comfortable," she said, her voice low and menacing. "You may be family, but that doesn't mean you belong here." The words hung in the air, cold and final. Tan turned away, her hands shaking. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows pressing closer. She felt trapped, like an animal in a cage. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if they would ever escape this suffocating existence, or if the house would consume them entirely. Part 3. Whispers in the Dark. The first night it happened, Tan thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. She lay awake, the silence of the house so thick it pressed against her chest, making each breath feel labored. Sang's soft snores beside her were the only reassurance she had that she wasn't entirely alone. But then there was a creak, a long, slow groan of wood shifting under unseen weight. Her heart stilled, and she strained to hear, every nerve in her body taut. The sound came again, closer this time, like someone dragging heavy feet across the floorboards. Tan pushed herself up on trembling arms. The room was shrouded in shadows, and the dim glow of moonlight barely pierced through the small, dirty window. For a moment, all was quiet. She could almost convince herself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind playing tricks. But then she felt it, a cold draft that brushed past her cheek like icy fingers. Her breath caught, and she glanced around, half expecting to see a shape in the darkness. There was nothing, only the oppressive stillness and the faint scent of mildew. "Sang," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Sang, wake up." He stirred, groaning as he turned over. "What is it?" Listen, Tan said, her voice tight with fear. But as they both sat in silence, the noises had ceased. Only the wind remained, whistling softly through unseen cracks. Sang sighed heavily, his exhaustion evident. "It's just the old house," he muttered, turning away. "Go to sleep. Tan, but sleep was elusive. Every creak, every whisper of wind set her nerves on edge. Hours passed before she finally drifted off, only to be haunted by restless dreams filled with shadows that stretched too long and eyes that gleamed in the dark. The next day, Tan tried to push the night's events from her mind. She kept busy, scrubbing the floors and tending to the children. Bao and Mai clung to her, their eyes wary and wide. Mama, Mai whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't like the dark corners. I think something's hiding there. Tan forced a smile and hugged her daughter tightly. There's nothing there, sweet one, she said, though her voice shook, just shadows. But the shadows didn't feel empty. Every time she passed the family altar in the main room, a dusty relic dedicated to Min's late father, she felt the air grow colder, heavier. The photograph on the altar, a stern man with hollow eyes, seemed to follow her. She avoided looking at it, but every now and then she'd catch a flicker of movement in her peripheral vision. It was as if the eyes shifted just slightly when she wasn't looking. That evening, after the children were tucked into their makeshift bed, Tan lingered by the altar. She told herself she was being foolish, that grief and exhaustion were making her see things that weren't there. But as she reached out to straighten the picture frame, an icy chill shot up her arm. She recoiled, gasping, and the room seemed to darken around her. Her breath fogged in the cold air, and for a heartbeat she thought she heard a faint whisper, low and unintelligible, like words spoken underwater. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The cold dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving her shaking. It's just the wind, she whispered to herself. It's nothing. But that night the noises returned. They were louder, more insistent, scratching, shuffling, as if something moved within the walls. Tan lay rigid, her eyes wide in the dark. The cold draft swept through the room again, and this time it lingered. She heard it then, a soft, almost playful whisper, so close it brushed against her ear. Leave it seemed to say, the words stretched and distorted. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the whisper continued, a mocking echo that refused to be silenced. Sang woke to find her trembling. Tan, what's wrong is not just the wind, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something here, he frowned, his expression a mixture of worry and exhaustion. You're scaring yourself. This house is old, it makes noises. That's all. But Tan shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. No, I felt it. I heard it. It's not just noises. Sang, his shoulders slumped. We can't do this. We have nowhere else to go. We can't let fear make things worse. But it was already worse. The house creaked and groaned as if in agreement. Over the next few days, the oppressive atmosphere grew heavier. The children became restless, their laughter fading into fearful glances and hushed whispers. Mai refused to go near the family altar, and Bao spoke of cold hands that touched him at night. Tan's attempts to reassure them felt hollow, even to her. One night, as she sat by the dim glow of a flickering candle, the shadows seemed to dance on the walls. She watched them, her breath shallow, unable to look away. They moved in ways that shadows shouldn't, curling and twisting as if alive. Her pulse quickened when one shadow broke away from the rest, sliding across the floor like a liquid mass. But it slithered toward the altar, where it pooled beneath the photograph of Min's father. The air grew cold, and Dan's breath came out in visible puffs. She clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. Show yourself, she whispered, not knowing why she spoke or to whom she spoke. The shadow stilled, and for a moment there was only silence. Then a low, guttural groan echoed through the room, vibrating in her bones. The candle flickered wildly, then snuffed out, plunging her into darkness. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, filled her ears. They stopped just behind her. Go away, she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. But nothing answered. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. In the days that followed, Tan's fear grew. Sang tried to dismiss it, to keep them grounded in reality, but even he began to falter. The noises, the cold drafts, the flickering shadows, none of it could be explained away. At night, the children clung to their parents, too scared to close their eyes. The whispers grew bolder, louder, and always near the altar. Tan felt trapped, as if the house itself was closing in on her, feeding on their fear. One evening, as she passed the altar, she paused, drawn to the photograph. The eyes seemed to bore into her, filled with malice. She leaned in closer, unable to resist. The air around her turned frigid, and a voice clearer this time whispered, "You don't belong here." She staggered back, her heart pounding. The photograph fell from the altar, shattering on the floor. Sang rushed in at the sound, but when he saw the broken glass and the pale, terrified look on Dan's face, he knew the house was not just old. It was something else, something hungry, something watching. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting them go. Part 4. Mai's Night Terror. The night was thick with an unnatural silence, the kind that made even the slightest noise reverberate like a shout. Tan lay in the dark, eyes open and unblinking, as she listened to the rhythmic breathing of her family. Sleep was a luxury she no longer dared to embrace. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind felt like a threat. She gripped the thin blanket tighter, trying to push away the gnawing sense of dread that had taken root deep inside her chest. Somewhere in the shadows, a faint scratching began. At first it was so soft that she thought it might be a mouse, but then it grew louder, more deliberate, a slow, grating sound that moved along the walls. Tan's breath caught in her throat, and she turned her head slowly, scanning the darkness. The noise stopped, as if it knew she was listening. She told herself it was nothing, just another trick of the old house. But deep down, she knew better. In the next room, Mai and Bao shared a small, uncomfortable bed. The room was cold, far colder than it should have been, and the moonlight that filtered through the cracked window cast long, spindly shadows across the floor. Mai shifted under a thin blanket, her small body shivering despite her attempts to curl into herself for warmth. Sleep eluded her, chased away by the oppressive chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. Then the temperature dropped even further. The air became so cold that each breath Mai took formed a small puff of mist. She opened her eyes, confused and afraid. A low creaking sound echoed from the corner of the room, where the shadows were deepest. At first she thought it was just her imagination, a trick of light and exhaustion. But then she saw it. A figure, impossibly thin and unnaturally tall, stood just beyond the reach of the moonlight. Its form was shrouded in darkness, as if it absorbed the light around it. Long skeletal arms hung at its sides, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Though its face was hidden, Mai felt its gaze cold, piercing, and filled with malice. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing down on her chest until she could barely breathe. For a moment she was frozen. Fear locked her limbs, and her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. The floorboards groaned under its weight, a sickening sound that sent shivers down her spine. Finally the paralysis broke, and Mai's terror erupted in a piercing scream that shattered the silence. "Mama! Papa!" she cried, her voice raw and filled with panic. Tan was out of bed in an instant, her heart racing as she stumbled through the dark. Sang followed, his movements slower, weighed down by fatigue and disbelief. They burst into the children's room to find Mai curled up against the wall, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Bao clung to her, his face pale and wide-eyed. The air in the room was icy, and Tan could see her breath in the dim light. "Mai, what happened?" Dan's voice was shaky, but she forced herself to sound strong. Mai pointed to the corner, her hand trembling. "It was there," she whispered. "A shadow. It was standing right there." Sang moved to the corner, his expression hardening. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice strained. He ran his hand along the wall, tapping lightly. "See? Just an old house. You had a nightmare," no, Mai insisted, tears streaming down her face. "It was real. I saw it. It was watching me." Tan knelt beside her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "It's okay, Mai. You're safe now. We're here." But Mai's body was rigid, and her eyes never left the dark corner. Tan felt a cold dread settle over her. She believed Mai she could feel the residual chill, the oppressive heaviness that clung to the room like a shroud. But what could she do? How could she protect her children from something she couldn't see, something that shouldn't exist? Sang tried to dismiss it, to reassure himself as much as his family. "It's just stress," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We're all on edge. The mind plays tricks," but as he spoke, the wind outside howled, rattling the windows with such force that it felt like the house itself was protesting. Tan glanced at Sang, hoping to find comfort in his eyes, but all she saw was the mask of a man desperately trying to hold everything together. She knew he wanted to believe it was all in their heads. The alternative was too terrifying to consider. In the days that followed, tensions grew like a festering wound. Tuyet, ever perceptive and cruel, seized on the opportunity to deepen the rift. Screaming in the night now, she sneered over breakfast. "Is this what we have to put up with? I thought we took in a family, not a pack of wild animals." Min said nothing, his gaze fixed on his plate. The silence was worse than any insult. Tan bit back her anger, focusing instead on calming Mai, who sat trembling beside her. Bao's hand was clasped tightly in hers, his small fingers cold and clammy. The children had become shadows of themselves, their laughter gone, replaced by fear and silence. That night, Tan stayed with the children, refusing to leave their side. She held them close, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Hours passed, and just as her eyes began to droop with exhaustion, the cold returned. It seeped through the walls, settling around them like a suffocating blanket. Tan's breath caught in her throat. She felt it, the presence, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the dark. "Sang," she whispered, but there was no response. Only the oppressive silence and the shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe on their own. Tears streamed down her face as she tightened her hold on Mai and Bao. Whatever haunted this house, it was growing bolder. And despite Sang's attempts to explain it away, Tan knew they were facing something far beyond the realm of nightmares. It was real, and it was hungry. When morning finally came, it brought no relief. The sunlight was pale and weak, barely penetrating the gloom. Tuyet's disdainful glances grew sharper, and Ming's silence became a barrier they could not cross. The house, once merely old and worn, now felt like a living thing, a predator that had trapped them within its walls. Mai's night terror was just the beginning. Whatever lurked in the shadows was not content to be ignored. It wanted to be seen, to be feared. And as Dan looked at her children, she realized with a sickening certainty that it would not rest until it had consumed every last shred of their hope and sanity. Part 5. Hostility and Isolation. The days blurred together in a suffocating fog of tension and fear. Dan moved through the house as if treading on broken glass, each step measured, each word carefully chosen to avoid Tuyet's wrath. But no matter how hard she tried to keep the peace, it was a battle she could not win. Tuyet's animosity had grown sharper, a blade honed by contempt and disdain. Every glance, every word was an attack disguised as a passing comment. One morning, as Dan was hanging laundry in the cramped backyard, Tuyet approached, her arms crossed and her eyes cold. "Don't hang those there," she said, her voice as harsh as the winter wind. "They block the sunlight, not that you care about anyone else's comfort." Dan paused, her hands trembling as she adjusted the line. "I'm sorry. I'll move them." Tuyet stepped closer, her shadow falling over Tan like a dark cloud. "You're always sorry, aren't you?" she sneered. "Sorry you failed? Sorry you're here? Sorry you're a burden?" The word struck like a physical blow. Tan bit her lip, tasting blood. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but the weight of their circumstances pressed down on her, suffocating any protest. She lowered her head and continued her work, each motion robotic, each breath heavy with shame. Behind her, Tuyet let out a bitter laugh. "That's right. Keep your head down. Maybe if you make yourself small enough, no one will notice you." As Tuyet walked away, Tan's vision blurred with tears. She turned her gaze to the garden, hoping to find a moment's solace. Instead, she saw Bao standing at the edge, staring into the tangled mess of weeds and overgrown bushes. His expression was distant, his eyes unfocused. He had been spending more time there lately, drawn to the shadows that lingered among the gnarled trees. "Bao," Tan called softly, wiping her eyes and walking toward him. "What are you doing?" He didn't turn. His small shoulders were hunched, and his hands hung limply at his sides. "I can hear it, Mama," he whispered. A chill ran down her spine. She knelt beside him, trying to meet his gaze. "Hear what, Bao?" He tilted his head, as if listening to something only he could hear. "The whispers, they come from the garden." Tan's heart pounded. "What whispers?" "Bao, you're scaring me." He finally looked at her, his eyes dark and haunted. "It doesn't like us, Mama. It says we shouldn't be here for a moment." She couldn't breathe. The wind rustled the leaves, and the shadows seemed to stretch and shift. She pulled him close, wrapping her arms around him as if she could shield him from whatever darkness had seeped into their lives. "It's just your imagination," she said, but her voice shook. "You're tired." This place is old, it makes noises, but Bao shook his head. It's not just noises, it's watching that night. Tan told Sang about their son's strange words. He listened with a frown, his jaw clenched tight. It's a stress, he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. We're all on edge. He's just a child, he doesn't understand. But what if it's more than that? Tan pressed, her eyes wide with fear. What if something is really enough? Sang's voice was sharper than he intended, and he immediately regretted it when he saw the hurt in her eyes. He took a deep breath and softened his tone. We can't give in to fear, Dam. We have to stay strong for the children. She nodded reluctantly, but the fear did not leave her. That night she stayed awake, listening for the whispers Bao had spoken of. She heard nothing, but the oppressive silence was worse. It pressed down on her like a weight, filling her lungs with dread. Beside her, Sang lay motionless, pretending to sleep. The next morning, Tuyet's mockery reached a new level. I heard your son talking to himself in the garden, she said, her voice dripping with false concern. Should we be worried? Perhaps he's... Touched Dan's hands clenched into fists. Leave him alone. Oh, I would, but it's hard to ignore when he's wandering around. Mumbling about shadows, Tuyet continued, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Maybe you should keep a closer eye on him. Before Dan could respond, Ming entered the room. His presence should have been a shield, a reminder that they were still family, but he merely glanced at them, his expression unreadable, and walked past without a word. The silence he left behind was deafening. Bao grew more withdrawn with each passing day. He refused to play, refused to speak except in cryptic murmurs about the garden and the presence that watched him. Mai clung to Dan, her small body trembling whenever night fell. Sang tried to distract himself with repairs and odd jobs, but the tension in the house was a constant reminder of their fragile state. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of candlelight set them on edge. One evening, as they sat together in the dim light, Bao suddenly stood and walked toward the door. Tan reached for him, panic rising in her chest. Bao, where are you going? He turned, his face pale and expressionless. It wants me to come. Sang grabbed his son, his grip firm but desperate. No one wants anything, Bao. You're staying here. Bao's eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. It won't stop. The weight of his words hung over them like a storm cloud. Sang pulled Bao close, holding him tightly as if he could squeeze the fear out of him. But the fear was not just Bao's, it belonged to all of them now, a living, breathing thing that fed on their despair. That night the wind howled outside, and the house groaned in response. Tuyet's laughter echoed through the halls, cold and mocking. Dan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more they could endure. The isolation, the hostility, the creeping sense of dread, it was eating them alive. In the darkness she whispered a prayer. Not for escape, she knew that was impossible, but for strength, for a flicker of hope to hold on to. Because if the whispers in the garden were real, if the shadows were watching, then they would need every bit of strength they had just to survive. Part 6. Signs of the Supernatural. The first sign that things were worsening came as a touch. It was subtle, almost easy to dismiss as a trick of the mind, but Tan knew it was real. She had been cleaning the small kitchen, scrubbing at a stubborn stain on the counter, when it happened. A cold, feather-like touch on the back of her neck. She froze, every muscle in her body going rigid. The room suddenly felt colder, the air thick and heavy. Slowly she turned, expecting to see one of the children playing a prank or maybe Sang. But the kitchen was empty, the shadows deep and unmoving. Hello, she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a moment she felt the walls pressing in around her. It was only when she forced herself to move again that the chill receded, leaving her breathless and shaking. By the time Sang returned home that evening, Tan had convinced herself it was nothing. She needed it to be nothing. But as the days passed, the occurrences multiplied, each more unsettling than the last. There were times when she would catch movement out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of a shadow that disappeared the moment she turned her head. Small objects, spoons, cups, even her comb moved from their places without explanation. The air was often cold, far colder than it should have been, and the chill seemed to follow her like an unwelcome guest. Then tried to talk to Sang about it one night as they lay in bed. The children were asleep, their small bodies curled under thin blankets. Something is wrong with this house, she said, her voice low but urgent. I can't explain it, but it's real. Sang let out a weary sigh. Tan, we've been through this. The house is old. It creaks, it groans. We're all under stress. No, she insisted, her voice trembling. It's not just a house. I feel it like it's watching us. Like it wants something. He turned to her, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. What do you want me to say? That I believe there's some spirit here? We have enough problems without adding ghosts to the list. You don't have to believe, Dan whispered, tears welling in her eyes. But please, don't dismiss me. Sang reached for her hand, his grip firm but cold. I'm trying to keep us together. We can't afford to give in to fear, but fear had already taken hold. It crept into every corner of the house, wrapped itself around Dan's heart, and refused to let go. The following night, as she prepared to climb into bed, she noticed something strange. The air was colder than usual, a biting chill that made her shiver despite the heavy blanket draped over her shoulders. She knelt to check for drafts and lifted the edge of the mattress. Her blood turned to ice. Bones. Small, brittle bones lay scattered beneath the bed. Some were no bigger than her finger, others longer and more jagged. They were not arranged in any recognizable pattern, but there was something about their placement that felt deliberate, calculated. Dan's breath caught in her throat, and she dropped the mattress with a muffled thud. What is it? Sang asked, his tone impatient. She struggled to find her voice. There are bones under the bed, she managed, her words barely a whisper. He frowned, moving to lift the mattress himself. His expression hardened when he saw the bones. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pushed the mattress down with more force than necessary. It's probably an animal, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Rats. Maybe rats don't arrange bones like that, Dan said, her voice shaking. Sang, this isn't normal, it doesn't matter, he snapped, anger flashing in his eyes. We can't afford to let this, whatever this is, break us. We have to focus. But how could she focus when every moment felt like a waking nightmare? The bones were just the beginning. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched intensified. It was always there, a weight on her chest that made it hard to breathe. When she cooked, she felt eyes on her back. When she cleaned, shadows moved just out of sight. The children were no better. Bao rarely spoke, and when he did, it was often in hushed tones about the cold hands that touched him at night. Mai clung to them at all times, her small body trembling whenever they walked past the altar in the main room. One afternoon, as Dan scrubbed the floorboards, she heard a faint whisper. It was soft, almost gentle, but unmistakably real. Leave, it said, the word drawn out and distorted. She dropped the rag and spun around, her heart pounding. The room was empty, but the air was cold, and the shadows seemed darker, more oppressive. Desperate, Dan turned to Min. Please, she begged, her voice cracking. There's something wrong with this house. You must have noticed it. Min's eyes flickered, but he said nothing. His silence was worse than any denial. It was an admission, a confirmation of her deepest fears. Tuyet, however, was not so restrained. She laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed through the house. You're losing your mind, she said, her smile cruel. Maybe you should leave. Spare the rest of us your madness. But Tan couldn't leave. There was nowhere to go. The house was a prison, and whatever haunted it was closing in. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt the cold touch again, this time on her ankle. It was firmer, more insistent, and it pulled. She screamed, thrashing against the unseen grip, until Sam woke and grabbed her. It's not real, he said, his voice desperate. You're dreaming. But she wasn't. The bruises on her ankle the next morning proved that much. She tried to show them to Sang, to make him understand, but he turned away. We can't do this, he whispered. We can't fall apart. He was already slipping away, retreating into denial and silence. And as Dan watched him walk out the door, she realized that whatever was in the house wasn't just haunting them, it was tearing them apart. Alone in the oppressive silence, she felt the shadows creep closer, felt the cold seep into her bones. It was real, and it wasn't going to let them go. Part 7. The warning ignored. The days stretched on, each one darker, more oppressive than the last. The house seemed to grow colder, its walls tightening like a noose around Dan and her family. It was no longer just creaking floorboards or the occasional cold draft. The air itself felt charged with a sinister presence, and shadows moved as if with a life of their own. Tan had grown used to watching the corners of her eyes, bracing for movement that seemed impossible. But it never got easier, the fear never dulled. One night, as she prepared a meager dinner, the flickering candlelight seemed to dance more erratically than usual. The shadows it cast on the wall stretched and twisted, forming shapes that defied logic. Tan paused, the knife trembling in her hand. She watched as one particularly long shadow detached itself from the wall and slid across the floor. It crept closer, its movement slow but deliberate. Tan's chest tightened, and she struggled to breathe. When the shadow reached her feet, it halted, pulling around her like dark ink. A cold touch, light as a feather, but unmistakably real, brushed against her wrist. She dropped the knife, its clatter echoing through the small kitchen. The touch lingered, tracing a path up her arm, leaving a trail of icy dread in its wake. Then yanked her arm away and stumbled back, pressing herself against the counter. Her pulse thundered in her ears. She could feel it now, a presence, invisible but palpable, watching her with cold, unfeeling eyes. "Sang," she screamed, her voice raw with terror. Within moments he burst into the room, his eyes wide and alarmed. "What happened?" he demanded, his gaze darting around for any sign of danger. Tan pointed to the spot where the shadow had been, but it was gone. The room looked normal, empty and still. She clutched her arm, the spot where the phantom touch had lingered, still cold to the touch. "It was here," she whispered. "It touched me." Sang's face hardened. "You're scaring yourself, Tang." "No," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "It's real. I felt it, seen it. This house is." Rongi moved closer, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Listen to me. We can't give in to this. We have nowhere else to go. We can't afford to lose ourselves." "But it's tearing us apart," she said, her voice breaking. "It's not just me. The children feel it too." Bao is terrified. Sang's expression darkened, and he glanced toward the other room where their children sat. "They're scared because they see you like this," he said, his voice low. "We have to be strong." "You're not listening," Dan said, her desperation mounting. "Please, Sang, we need to leave." "We can't," he said, his tone final. "There's no place else. We have to make it work." But Tan knew making it work was impossible. Whatever haunted this house was growing stronger, and its grip on them was tightening. That night, as they tried to sleep, Tan lay awake, her body tense and her mind racing. She felt Sang's warmth beside her, but it was no comfort. The darkness around them was alive, pulsing with malevolence. A sudden noise, a low, raspy whisper, broke the silence. Tan's eyes snapped open. She turned her head slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The whispering grew louder, swirling around the room like a cruel wind. Shadows danced on the walls, forming shapes that shouldn't have existed. And then she saw it, a dark figure standing at the foot of their bed, its form barely more than a silhouette. Its eyes, if it had any, were hidden in the darkness, but its intent was clear. It was watching, then reached for Sang, shaking him awake. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling. He groaned and rubbed his eyes. "What is it now?" "Look," she insisted, pointing to the figure. But when he turned, it was gone. The shadows had returned to their normal shapes, and the whispering had stopped. Only the oppressive silence remained. "There's nothing there," Sang said, his voice filled with weary frustration. "But it was there," Tan insisted, her voice cracking. "I swear it. You need rest," Sang said, lying back down. "You're letting fear take over." She wanted to scream, to make him understand, but she knew it was pointless. He had closed himself off, unwilling or unable to see what was happening. She lay back down, her body trembling, and closed her eyes. Sleep was impossible. The next day, Bao refused to leave her side. He clung to her arm, his small face pale and drawn. "Mama, please don't leave me," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. "I won't, my love," she said, pulling him close. "I'm here," but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. He had stopped sleeping alone, insisting on staying with his parents or his sister at all times. When they tried to coax him back into his own bed, he sobbed uncontrollably, begging not to be left in the dark. "It's waiting for me," he said, his voice shaking. "In the shadows. He wants to take me." Sang tried to reassure him, but even he seemed shaken. The cracks in his stoic facade were beginning to show. As the days passed, the supernatural occurrences became more brazen. Doors slammed shut without warning. Objects moved on their own. Shadows stretched and shifted, creeping closer whenever no one was looking. Anne could feel the house's malevolence pressing down on her, suffocating and relentless. One afternoon, as she walked through the dim hallway, she felt a sudden, sharp pain on her back like icy claws raking across her skin. She stumbled forward, gasping. When she reached back, her fingers came away wet with blood. She ran to the mirror, lifting her shirt to reveal 3 long, jagged scratches. They were deep, and they burned with a cold fire. She showed Sang, her eyes wide with terror. "Look at this," she said, her voice shaking. "Tell me this is normal." He stared at the marks, his face pale. But instead of acknowledging the truth, he shook his head. "You must have scratched yourself without realizing it. Are you serious?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "This is not an accident. Sang, you have to believe me." He turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "We can't fall apart," he whispered. "If we do, it wins. It's already winning," Dan said, her voice raw. "And it won't stop until it has all of us." But Sang refused to listen. He retreated further into himself, his denial becoming a shield against the reality they faced. And in the shadows the house watched and waited, its power growing stronger with each passing moment. Bao's fear deepened, and Mai's laughter was a distant memory. The family was crumbling, and the house knew it. It fed on their despair, their isolation. It wanted them broken, and it was succeeding. As night fell once more, Tan lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the house. She felt the cold touch again, this time on her face. It lingered, a mocking caress that sent shivers down her spine. She knew the warning had been given, and it had been ignored. Whatever haunted their home would not stop until it had consumed them all. And as she lay there in the dark, she realized that leaving might no longer be an option. The house had already claimed them. Part 8. The Haunting Revealed. The storm came without warning, crashing into the village with a ferocity that rattled windows and bent trees to their breaking point. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the old house in harsh, white flashes that seemed to highlight every crack and flaw in its decaying structure. Thunder rolled through the night, a low, menacing growl that shook the very foundation of the home. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with something far more oppressive than the storm outside, a presence that had been lurking, waiting for this exact moment to reveal itself. Tan paced the narrow hallway, her heart pounding. Every flash of lightning cast fleeting, distorted shadows that danced along the walls. It felt as if the house itself was shifting, bending under the weight of something unseen but powerful. But Sang sat in the main room, his hands clenched tightly around a cup of cold tea. He hadn't touched it in hours. Bao and Mai huddled together on a small, worn-out mattress, their eyes wide with fear. Each crack of thunder made them flinch, their small bodies trembling. "It's just a storm," Sang said, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice was tight, strained, as if he were trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. But his eyes betrayed him. They darted to every corner of the room, searching for movement in the darkness. Nortan whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "It's more than that." As if in response, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only illumination came from the intermittent flashes of lightning, each one casting eerie, shifting shadows across their pale faces. A sudden deafening bang echoed through the house. It was followed by another and another door slamming shut with impossible force. The children screamed, clutching at their mother. Sang Tan cried, her voice raw with terror. "Something's here." He rose to his feet, his movement slow and deliberate, as if every muscle in his body was resisting. "Stay with the children," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at authority. He took a hesitant step toward the hallway, where the banging continued. The sound was relentless, a brutal rhythm that seemed to shake the very walls. Then the whispers began. They were low at first, a faint murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But they grew louder, more insistent, and unholy chorus that filled the air with words that twisted and writhed, too distorted to understand. Tang covered her ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The whispers seeped into her mind, a cold, slithering presence that made her stomach churn. Sang pressed on, his steps echoing in the hallway. The temperature plummeted, and his breath fogged in the air. "Show yourself," he demanded, his voice cracking. Enough of this, the whispering stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, oppressive. Sam felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned slowly, sensing that he was no longer alone. At the far end of the hallway, barely illuminated by the next flash of lightning, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its form shrouded in darkness. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, a swirling mass of shadow that seemed to pull the light toward it. Sang's blood ran cold. The figure took a step forward, its movements impossibly smooth, as if it were gliding. "Stay back," he whispered, but his words were swallowed by the oppressive silence. The air around him grew colder still, biting at his skin. But the figure raised one skeletal hand and pointed, its intent clear. Pain lanced through Sang's chest, and he fell to his knees, gasping for breath. He could feel it now, the entity's hatred, its desire to consume and destroy. It wasn't just haunting them, it wanted to break them, to twist their fear into something it could feed on. He had dismissed Dan's warnings for too long, but now there was no denying it. This was no trick of the mind, no figment of stress and exhaustion. It was real, and it was here. Sang Tan's voice cut through the fog of pain. She rushed to him, pulling him back with all her strength. The figure's gaze, or whatever passed for its gaze, shifted to her, and the air seemed to vibrate with malice. The whispers returned, louder than before, screaming words that made no sense but left a deep, gnawing fear in their wake. "Get away from her," Sang roared, finding strength he didn't know he had. He pulled them behind him, shielding her from the entity's gaze. The figure paused, as if considering him before its form began to shift and ripple. Shadows poured from it, spreading across the floor like tendrils of darkness. They reached for Sang and Tong, curling around their ankles, their touch cold and suffocating. The children's screams cut through the chaos. Bao and Mai were trapped in the corner, their eyes wide with terror as the shadows closed in. Tan broke free from Sang's grip and ran to them, pulling them close. "You won't take them," she screamed, her voice raw with defiance. The entity tilted its head, almost as if amused. The shadows tightened their grip, and Tan felt her strength waning. The air around them pulsed with a sinister energy, and the walls of the house seemed to close in, pressing down on them. Sang struggled to his feet, his body shaking. He had spent so long denying the truth, but now there was no room for disbelief. If they didn't fight, they would be lost. "Leave us," he shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You have no power here." The entity paused, its form flickering, as if in response to his defiance. But the shadows did not retreat. They pressed closer, suffocating and cold. Sang reached for anything he could use, a broken piece of wood, a candle holder, but his hands were trembling too much to grasp anything firmly. Despair washed over him. How could they fight something they couldn't touch, couldn't understand? The whispers grew deafening, a cacophony of rage and malice. Tan clutched her children, her tears mixing with sweat as she whispered words of comfort she didn't believe. The shadows writhed around them, and the air grew colder still. It was as if the house itself had become a living, malevolent thing, bent on consuming them all. Then, in a moment of clarity, Sang saw the flicker of light, the altar, the photograph of Min's father, the one that seemed to watch them with unblinking eyes. He stumbled toward it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This is your hold, isn't it?" he shouted, his voice desperate. "This is how you stay." The shadows hesitated, and for the briefest moment the whispers faltered. Sang grabbed the photograph and hurled it to the ground. It shattered, and the entity let out a guttural roar that shook the walls. The shadows recoiled, their tendrils withdrawing as if burned. The air grew lighter, the oppressive weight lifting. But it wasn't over. The figure remained, its form flickering with rage. It lunged at Sang, its movements a blur of darkness. Tan screamed, pulling the children closer. Time seemed to slow. Sang braced himself, but instead of striking, the entity stopped inches from him, its form writhing. It let out a final, ear-piercing scream before dissolving into the shadows, which retreated into the corners of the house, leaving only silence in their wake. The storm outside began to wane, the wind dying down to a soft whisper. But inside, the damage was done. Sang fell to his knees, gasping for air. Tan and the children clung to each other, their bodies shaking. The house for now was still. But they all knew the truth: the battle was over, but the war had just begun. The entity had revealed itself, and its intent was clear. It would not stop until it had consumed them all. Part 9. Fleeing the Shadows. Morning came reluctantly, the pale light barely piercing the thick, oppressive gloom that clung to the house. The air felt heavy, as if it were resisting the dawn itself. Tan opened her eyes, every muscle in her body aching. Sleep had been impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the cracks had kept her on edge. She knew they couldn't stay another day. Whatever haunted this place would not rest until it had consumed them. She sat up slowly, her eyes scanning the room. Sang was already awake, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't slept either. She could see it in the dark circles under his eyes, the way his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He met her gaze, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They both knew what had to be done. "Get the children," Sang said, his voice rough and tired. "We need to leave." Tan nodded, her heart pounding. She moved to where Bao and Mai lay curled together, their small bodies trembling even in sleep. She touched their shoulders gently, and they woke with a start, fear flashing in their eyes. "Mama," Mai whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it still here?" "We're leaving," Tan said, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "We're going somewhere safe." The children clung to her as they rose, their eyes darting to every shadow that lingered in the corners of the room. Tan could feel their fear, an almost tangible presence that seemed to seep into the air around them. She kept her movements quick, gathering what little they had brought with them. Every creak of the house made her flinch. Every flicker of shadow sent a shiver down her spine. The walls seemed closer now, pressing in as if the house itself was aware of their intentions. Sang moved with urgency, stuffing their belongings into a warm bag. His hands trembled, betraying the fear he tried so hard to hide. "We have to be fast," he said, glancing toward the hallway. Before it, a loud crash echoed through the house, cutting him off. It was followed by a low, guttural groan that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, pooling around their feet like a living thing. The house was awake, and it knew they were trying to leave. "Go," Sang shouted, grabbing the bag and pushing Tan and the children toward the door. "Don't stop." They stumbled into the hallway, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadows moved with them, writhing and stretching as if trying to block their path. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and a faint whispering filled the air, a chorus of voices, angry and relentless. Tan held tightly to Bao and Mai, her heart racing. She could feel the malevolence pressing in on them, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. As they reached the front door, it slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them like a storm. Sang yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was ice cold under his fingers, and the door seemed to pulse as if alive. "Open," he shouted, desperation in his voice. He pounded on the door, his fists leaving red marks on the wood. Tan turned, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows in the hallway were moving, coalescing into a dark, formless mass. It slithered toward them, filling the air with a sickening chill. She could see faint shapes within the darkness, faces twisted in agony, eyes that burned with hatred. "Please," she whispered, clutching her children. "Just let us go." The shadows paused, as if considering her words. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, they lunged. Cold tendrils wrapped around her ankles, pulling her back. She screamed, fighting against the icy grip. "Sang," she cried, her voice raw with fear. He turned, his eyes blazing with determination. "Let them go." He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it at the shadows. The metal passed through the darkness, but it seemed to slow them, if only for a moment. Ronnie shouted. "I'll hold it off," Noldan screamed, but Sang's eyes were fierce, unyielding. He swung the poker again, his movements frantic. "Get them out." With trembling hands, Tan pushed open a small window near the front door. The cold wind rushed in, cutting through the stifling heat of fear. She helped Bao and Mai through first, their small bodies slipping easily through the narrow opening. As she climbed out, she felt the shadows reach for her again, their touch like ice on her skin. She kicked out, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and tumbled onto the ground outside. The air was cold and crisp, but it felt like freedom. Bao and Mai were beside her, their eyes wide with terror. "Where's Papa?" Bao asked, his voice shaking. Before Tan could answer, Sang stumbled through the window, his face pale and lined with pain. The shadows inside the house writhed and twisted, their fury palpable. Sang fell to his knees, gasping for breath. "It's not over," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We have to go." They ran, their footsteps echoing in the early morning stillness. The village was silent, the houses dark and unwelcoming. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the faintest hint of a whisper, a reminder that they were not free. Then glanced back once, her breath catching in her throat. The house stood in the distance, its windows dark and empty. But she could feel its gaze, its malevolence seeping into the ground, waiting for them to return, or for new victims to stumble into its grasp. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the village. There they collapsed, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and fear. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the fields. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The darkness they had escaped lingered within them, a heavy weight that would not lift. "We're free," Dam whispered, clutching her children tightly. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. They had left the house behind, but its shadows would follow them. It had left its mark, a cold, lingering presence that would haunt their dreams, whisper in their ears, and remind them of the darkness they had barely escaped. The family held each other, their breaths mingling in the cold morning air. The house would wait, its dark presence rooted deep in the earth. And somewhere it whispered of vengeance, of shadows that would rise again, waiting, watching, never truly gone.